Hi, this is John Potter and welcome to session 5 of Leadership in Action. And in this session we're going to have a look at effective team leadership.
In this session, session 5, we're going to look at the very basic building block of leadership, particularly effective leadership, and that's effective team leadership. Earlier in this series, we talked about 3 levels of leadership: strategic, operational and frontline or team. And this slide particularly reminds us that understanding team leadership really involves us understanding a little bit of the social psychology of social episodes, that is, particular situations with a group of people, an objective and a particular time-bounded situation. So in this slide 2, we talk about leadership levels, and in particular we introduce the work of Joseph Forgas. Joseph Forgas is a social psychologist, and he reminds us of these 3 levels of leadership in his writings, and we're going to have a look at some of the important aspects of team leadership and the basic building block of organisational leadership as we go through the session. So the concept of the social episode, what Joseph Forgas had to say, is really quite interesting because it does come from the viewpoint of social psychology of people working together. And the social episode is that unit of social behaviour whereby a group of people engage in a shared experience which may or may not have a specifically desired outcome. So we've already identified these 3 levels of leadership process, although it actually has to be said that the number of levels is probably infinite due to the complexity of what leadership is all about and leadership situations. However, it is convenient to look at leadership operating on the 3 levels of strategic, operational and frontline or team, really for the purposes of identifying organisational processes. Now in this session we are considering the issue of team leadership, sometimes called frontline leadership. And team leadership essentially operates when a number of individuals work together in a work or a social situation where that situation may be time-bounded or defined in some other set of specific terms. In essence, there may be a designated or an emergent leader, and a specific objective is usually involved with a prescribed time scale, which sometimes may be somewhat limited and short-term. And examples of team leadership would include both the indoor and outdoor leadership situations, which we mentioned in the earlier session covering John Adair's work. That was session 4. Now, the team is often thought of as the basic building block to leadership in an organisational setting, and Joseph Forgas' work was instrumental in the 1980s in terms of developing our understanding of the social episode and its relevance to team working. Now, a Google search based on Joseph Forgas' social psychology will give you a rich insight into his work, and it's a very useful insight. So before moving on to the next slide, slide 3, just consider the following study questions. Can you identify specific social episodes in which you've been involved and that have had successful outcomes, and then situations where the outcomes were less than successful? What were the differences between the 2 situations? Now in slide 3 we will look at what we call the team building blocks. We'll now look at effective team leadership from the viewpoint of understanding the nature of the team situation. And there are some basic issues about team working that do need to be addressed by the leader, including the idea that several people working together in an effectively led team situation create almost an extra mind due to the synergy created in the team. Well, amongst the basic aspects or basic team building blocks are balanced roles, clear objectives and agreed goals, openness and the ability to handle confrontation, support and trust, cooperation and conflict, sound operating procedures, appropriate leadership, a regular review, particularly of performance and outcomes, processes around developing individuals, sound intergroup relations, and also good communications. Now those factors really provide the basis for effective team leadership. So the study question for this particular slide is this: how effectively do you think you operate in terms of team leadership and in handling these team building blocks, which are very, very basic? Please have a thought about this question before moving on to the next slide. In slide 4, we consider the differences between a team and a group. Now, this has been an issue in team working for many years now, trying to work out what the differences are between a group of people that are simply a group and those that seem to bond or fuse together to form a team. Now, many writers have had a lot to say about this, and it tends to focus on really 5 issues. Firstly, it's all about the performance of the unit. The unit might be the team, it might be a team of 10 people, 12 people, or just 2 or 3. Secondly, it's about a sense of urgency and the skill that the team possesses as a unit. The kick-off, or how the work is started, and the basic rules of engagement between a team and group tend to be different. There's much more urgency, there's much more focus in a team, much more synergy in a team than usually we see in a group. And then, of course, we like quick wins, and teams constantly challenge each other. And then, of course, time comes into it, and the whole issue of positive feedback to actually improve the team's performance is key. Well, as you can see, trying to describe the difference between a team and a group is a bit like trying to describe an elephant. We all know one when we see one, but being specific about the details is difficult and sometimes rather complex. Teams do seem to have a synergy, as already mentioned, and, for example, an 8-person team operating effectively often seems to create a 9th mind due to that synergy. In more specific terms, the difference between a team and a group is often termed or determined by performance. Teams tend to be more focused and more outcome driven, with a sense of urgency related to the skills of the individual team members. At the start of the team working the way it's going to work, the kick-off as we call it, the actual energy at the kick-off time is very, very important. And then the basic rules of engagement as to how the team is going to work together seem to be very, very relevant. Team spirit, morale and team performance is often enhanced by successes and quick wins, and there's usually a vibrant atmosphere challenging how well the team is operating from within the team. Increased positive feedback over time, particularly from the leader, will tend to develop that team spirit, and as such is very important in terms of determining the success of the team. And the role of the leader of a team is to understand all these issues and promote the right issues in terms of the way the team operates. So before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to the following study questions. Firstly, can you identify some teams and groups in which you've been involved? What were the differences between those 2 types of situation which you can identify? What made the team a high-performance unit compared to the groups that you've experienced? An important part of the team leader's role is developing the team, and in slide 5 we see a number of the things we talk about in terms of team development. Not all teams start off as being effective. They all go through a process of development using a series of stages. Some progress through these stages rapidly, and others never develop beyond a particular stage. And there seems to be 4 main stages of team development, as we've already seen, plus 2 ancillary stages. However, these are not necessarily clearly defined in any particular team. There's often some overlap between the particular stages, one stage and another. In stage 1, we call it the forming or testing phase. The characteristics of the team are often as follows. People are polite, there's a great dependence on the leader, they're sometimes guarded, watchful, rather impersonal, there are no conflicts, a very low need for group identity, a concern for structure, sorting things out, methods, etc., and hidden agendas may well stay hidden. Now, in the second stage, which we call storming or confusion, the characteristics are often as follows. You start to get cliques forming who have influence. Conflicts start to occur and people are confronted. Hidden agendas start to be raised. There's often a struggle for leadership by these cliques, opting out, feeling stuck, people's own position sometimes feels threatened, they want to rationalize it, and a lack of listening is pretty apparent. Now, in the third stage of norming or getting organized, the following characteristics are often apparent. We develop procedures, issues are confronted, there's more open exchanges of ideas and viewpoints. These cliques, these separate little units within the team are dissolved, leadership is shared, there's more listening and cooperation, feedback is given, preconceived ideas are changed, and then creativity becomes much higher. Then in the fourth stage of performing or mature closeness, then the following characteristics tend to be noticeable. People seem to show resourcefulness, creativity. They're often flexible, open, much more effective, quite close and supportive with each other. There's a sort of settled interdependence, high group morale, warmth and closeness between members. Empathy starts to emerge and a high level of problem-solving behaviour becomes pretty clearly apparent. So as well as these basic four stages, with project teams for example, there may be some additional phases. The reforming phase, when a new member joins the team halfway through its operation, and then the adjourning or mourning phase, which happens when the team disbands. There's a bit of sadness because that corporate spirit has perhaps disappeared. Well, none of these phases should be avoided. Each of the main four phases can contribute to the development of the team, and sometimes it's useful to have a storming phase artificially introduced midway during the team's development to create some movement forward. All the phases play an important part in the development of a high-performing team. It's possible to pull these ideas together and create a prescription for the development of the team, and that is the task of the team leader. So, before moving on to the next slide, give some thought to the study questions. At what stage is the work team in which you are currently engaged? What actions can a team leader take to move the team through the various development stages? How can team learning be captured so that when a new team is formed, it has a knowledge base on which to work? So just give some thought to those questions before you move on to slide 6. Now, once a team is performing, the team leader can drive team performance in a number of ways, as we can see in slide 6. Firstly, it's important to establish a sense of urgency and high standards of performance and a clear direction. Secondly, the team members should be carefully selected for skill and skill potential, not just personality. In particular, their team role strengths must be taken into consideration. The initial meetings and actions are very important in terms of setting the culture of the team. Setting clear operating rules and rules of behaviour is key. Setting short-term goals to give some quick wins is important. Challenge the group regularly with fresh facts and information, and spend time interacting with the group members individually to ensure that they are forged into a team. And use positive feedback and knowledge of results as effectively as possible. So there are lots of things team leaders can do to drive team performance and improve that performance. So, before we move on to the next slide, just consider the study question. What other aspects of the team leader's operation can you identify to ensure that the team delivers a high level of performance with both synergy and high morale? It's now widely accepted that people operate in teams with certain preferences, and we call these team roles. Now, the idea of the team role as well as the professional role within a team was identified by Meredith Belbin back in the 1980s with his work on engineering project teams, which was undertaken at the Henley Management Centre. The team role preferences may be readily identified, and a balanced team should have at least one individual with a strong preference for one or two of these roles. With small teams of say 4 or 5 people, then it is important that each individual has more than one preference in order to cover the whole set and ensure a balanced team. So looking at the team roles, there is a need for creativity and ideas to be generated within the team, and we call this the plant role. And it's important to link the team with the world outside their own operation, and we call this the resource investigator role. The activities of the team need to be coordinated and focused, and we call this the coordinator role. The team should also have goals, direction and drive, and this is where the role of the shaper comes in. And someone should check on the quality of the work the team produces, and we call this the monitor evaluator role. Conflict and friction need to be managed within the team and smoothed over, and we call this the team worker role. And then ideas need to be turned into actions, and we call this the implementer role. Things need to be followed through to completion, and we call this the completer role. And then sometimes specialist skills are needed, and we call this the specialist role. It's worth noting that in Belbin's early work in the 80s, he only had the basic 8 roles, and the specialist role seemed to be added, if you like, later on to cope with complexity or specific technical issues within the team. Or the learning point for the team leader is that she or he needs to be aware of the range of team role preferences and then ensure that any team they lead contains a balanced set of individuals with as many of the team preferences as possible. Now, in the real world, this is not always easy, particularly if the leader inherits a team which is already formed rather than creating a new one. However, an awareness of team roles is important, and it is something with which leaders can work. So before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to the 2 study questions. Can you identify your personal team role preference? And how balanced do you think are the teams with which you are involved? And if you'd like to find out more about Belbin's team roles, the bibliography at the end of this session will give you more, but also a Google search of Belbin's team roles will actually come up with a lot of information for you. So just have a thought about the study questions before moving on to the next slide. Moving on to slide 8, we're now going to have a look at John Katzenbach's approach to effective team working. One of the more significant international figures in team working is John Katzenbach, who is actually a McKinsey consultant, and his thoughts on the nature of a team may be paraphrased as follows. A team is a small number of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, set of performance goals and approach for which they hold themselves mutually accountable. It is more than just a group of people. And Katzenbach comes up with 2 sets of findings about teams. Firstly, common sense findings, and then what he calls uncommon sense findings about teams. Now, he has a number of useful ideas, and if you would like to explore these, his book The Wisdom of Teams is very, very useful. There is also an article in the Harvard Business Review Library which you can find by going to the HBR site. The only thing about the Wisdom of Teams article is it is very much a summary, and if you really want to know about effective team leadership, the book The Wisdom of Teams is much, much more comprehensive. So let's have a look at Katzenbach's common sense findings. Firstly, he says that a demanding performance challenge tends to create a team rather than a group. The disciplined application of team basics is often overlooked. Team performance opportunities exist in all parts of the organization, and teams at the top of the organization tend to be the most difficult. Most organizations intrinsically prefer individual over group accountability. So that's, if you like, what he would call his common sense findings. But now we move on to what he would call his uncommon sense findings. Firstly, organizations with strong performance standards seem to spawn more real teams. than organisations that promote teams per se. High-performance teams are in fact extremely rare. Hierarchy and teams go together almost as well as teams and performance. Teams naturally integrate performance and learning, although that learning is not often captured, and teams are the primary unit of performance for increasing numbers of organisations. Most organisations warm to the idea of team working, particularly cross-functional teams and self-managing teams. That leadership in that case has to come from within the team rather than imposed on the top. So before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to our study question here. Do you agree with the notions of common sense and uncommon sense as regards to teams? Just give some thought to the differences that Katzenbach has actually pointed out in this slide. In slide 9, we see some further thoughts on teams from John Katzenbach, and he's quite reductionist in the way that he approaches things. His approach to defining teams, many people find it a useful one because he does get down to basics. He suggests that a team has 4 primary attributes: common commitment and purpose, performance goals, complementary skills, and mutual accountability. In addition, he proposes 3 types of teams: teams that recommend things, teams that make or do things, and then thirdly, teams that run things. Now the key issue here, particularly for the team leader, is to suggest that each of the 3 types of team has its own particular characteristics and requirements, particularly in terms of how it's led. So before moving on to the next slide, just give some thought to the following study questions. Can you identify any other types of teams to add to Katzenbach's basic 3 types? And what would you say are the differences between, say, a Formula One racing team servicing a racing car in the pit on the racetrack and a senior management team running an organisation? Now, despite the popular perception that effective team working is the way forward for many organisations, teams don't always perform to a high level. In particular, senior management teams are particularly prone to ineffective performance levels, due to a number of reasons. Firstly, the ambiguity of their work. Secondly, the politics at the top. And then thirdly, personal agendas at the senior levels in an organisation. And this somewhat negative perception of the top team should not undermine team performance at lower levels of the hierarchy, and the benefits of effective team operation, particularly at the front line level, should not be underestimated. Now, one interesting approach to addressing a team which is not performing effectively is that of Lencioni, who proposes 5 levels of team operation which must be addressed with a dysfunctional team. Before looking at those levels, though, just give some thought to the study question below. To what extent do you think the teams with which you are involved, particularly the top team in your organisation, are effective? Now, in slide 11, we see a graphical representation of Lencioni's approach to looking at the 5 dysfunctions of a team. Lencioni argues that the process for enabling a team to move from being dysfunctional to being high-performing is a 5-step process. The basic aspect of the team that must be created is that of trust. If there is an absence of trust, then individual team members will be reluctant to admit mistakes and will want to appear invulnerable in their positions within the team. Once the trust issue is successfully addressed, the next level of developing the team is to ensure that individuals can speak their minds and that they are not engaging in artificial harmony. The fear of conflict needs to be managed so that disagreements may be faced and resolved. The third level is to ensure that the team has a set of clearly identified goals to which all members are committed, to avoid ambiguity and uncertainty in terms of what the team should be working on. Following the establishment of a set of goals to which all members are committed, operating standards need to be defined to ensure that everyone is accountable for their performance. And finally, if all the underpinning aspects of the team are successfully addressed, the team can then focus on creating team results and team outputs to avoid issues regarding status and ego becoming dominant. The study question then, with Lencioni's 5-level model: thinking of a team with whom you are part, or one in which you have perhaps worked or work regularly, how would you rate that team in terms of their ability to operate effectively in the 5 levels which Lencioni has defined? In slide 12 we move on to the idea of focusing team energy through mission, vision and values. Now, a team can often be considered as a business enterprise on its own, and as such the importance of mission, vision and values becomes very important. It is part of a team leader's responsibilities to ensure that the team has a clear picture of the future that they're trying to create and what it sees as its sense of purpose and what is important in terms of the way the team operates. However, the leader should not attempt to enforce rigidly her or his own views on these 3 issues. What is important in today's world is to involve the team members in creating the mission, identifying the vision, and also creating value statements in order to obtain their buy-in, both in terms of hearts and minds. So, before leaving this slide, just give some thought to the study questions. What is the vision of the future that your team is trying to create? How would you describe the purpose of the team? And what is important in terms of the way the team operates? Now, creating trust is fundamentally important between a leader and the team, and also within the team. And the key issues in creating trust between the leader and the team are quite interesting when we start to consider them. We can see that effective team performance is very dependent on the level of trust both within the team and between the team and its leader, and trust is a very subjective issue and not particularly easy to describe or indeed measure. However, one way of considering the issue of trust is to consider 3 factors regarding the perception of the leader by the team members. And these factors are ambition, competence and integrity. Now, in an ideal world, the team leader would perhaps possess roughly equal measures of each of these attributes. In reality, we often encounter misalignments, such as highly ambitious and competent leaders who lack integrity. Or we may come across a highly competent leader with integrity who actually lacks ambition, and so on. The lesson for the team leader is to work at developing all 3 attributes at the same time. So our study questions are these. Can you identify leaders who have imbalances in the 3 main attributes? If so, can you identify a leader who is strong in integrity and competence but lacks ambition? Can you identify a leader who has ambitions but lacks competence and perhaps integrity is questionable? How would you actually rate yourself? Now, to finish off this session 5, let's look at slide 19, the bibliography. The first 2 books by Meredith Belbin are very useful in plotting the development of thought on team roles. His first work is produced in 1981 and it talks about the Henley College experiments with the project managers, and then he moves on in the early 90s to talk about team roles at work. 2 very, very useful books. Away from Belbin, there are other people who write quite a lot on teams, and particularly Leading Your Team by Andrew Lee and Michael Maynard, published by Nicholas Brealey, gives you a different perspective on leading your team, very much about team leadership. The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni is a very readable book. It's very much a case study, albeit a fictional case study, which enables you to see how one could put right a team, particularly a top team, which is dysfunctional. And then, of course, the core textbook, which we mentioned during the session, is The Wisdom of Teams by John Katzenbach and Douglas Smith, published by the Harvard Business School Press in 1993. That's the end of Session 5. We look forward to speaking with you in Session 6. Thank you.